In a positive mindset, Simon, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a business suit, was heading to a meeting. He was ecstatic that fate had delivered him Paul, packing folders full of papers into a pricey leather briefcase. Because of his exceptional business acumen and the fact that their partnership's income had climbed dramatically during the year, he was the kind of partner that everyone could only dream of. At the age of 30, Simon began to consider starting a family. With the exception of certain issues with the applicants for his wife position, he did not endorse the contemporary trend of having children when one has gray whiskers. The man was able to see right through them and repeatedly set up a test to gauge their sentiments for him. His girlfriends all failed spectacularly, demonstrating that their main concern was his wealth and status. Simon needed a humble, good woman who would prioritize her love for him over her wealth and think about the house. After contemplating his daily routine, Simon eventually left his flat, making sure he had all the necessary paperwork. He walked out onto the street, gazed up at his penthouse's windows with joy, and then proceeded to his luxury car parked in the lot. Abruptly, he sensed a little pressure on his hand. Simon noticed a girl, perhaps 8 years old, who was ill-dressed. He could tell right away from her appearance that she was a typical beggar. Simon was expecting to hear her plea for money, but the girl's statement left him speechless and forced him to sit down on the bench and reflect. Attending the meeting with Paul was now completely out of the question. Simon's life had been very different from what it is now several years prior to these incidents. He was not wealthy, shared a small, claustrophobic apartment with his mother, and held a routine job as a programmer for a small computer company. But he had something far more valuable in life: his loving girlfriend, Elizabeth, whom he had previously engaged to, so it didn't bother him. The village where Elizabeth lived was close by and encircled by stunning mountains. Elizabeth, a primary school teacher, was unable to find employment in the unassuming tourist town. She lived with her grandmother and planned to move to the state capital after getting married to Simon in order to start over in a better place. However, the young lady had no idea how her grandmother would be involved in the events that followed. Mrs. Torres loved her granddaughter and wanted the best for her, even though she was already over 70. But Simon didn't give the elderly woman any confidence. Because he had issues with law enforcement when he was younger, she did not think he would be a trustworthy protector and support system for her granddaughter. He was on the police list and had been a troublemaker. Even though a lot of time had gone by and Simon had long since changed his ways and had a successful career, Mrs. Torres continued to think that someone who had broken the law once could do it repeatedly. The old woman had a view, and she had no intention of changing it. Thus, she told her grandchild over and over again, "Dear, you will grieve with the gangster. Leave him while it's not too late. Look how many good, hard-working men are around. They will carry you in their arms, but you are clinging to this Simon as if he is smeared with honey." "Oh, Grandma, why do you say that? Simon loves me very much, and I love him. What was in his life is long gone, and now he is completely different," replied Elizabeth. In general, the grandmother and granddaughter could not find a common language, but fortunately, it did not come to a major problem. Everyone just stuck to their own opinion. Elizabeth would have most likely followed her beloved, but one day they went for that unfortunate walk, which was fatal for them. On that wonderful summer evening, nothing foretold disaster. Simon and Elizabeth were going for a hike along a mountain river. When they arrived at the start of the trail, the weather changed slightly, and the sun disappeared behind the clouds. But the two lovers were so busy with each other that they did not notice anything around them. The air was filled with the wonderful aroma of greenery, and Simon and Elizabeth, holding hands, walked along the forest path, discussing their plans for the move. Looking shyly at his beloved, Simon said, "We'll rent an apartment first. My savings will be enough at first, and when we find a place to live, I'll start looking for a job. It's good that I have some income from remote work. I do not think that there will be problems with finances. I hope you do not have to work. After all, it is the duty of men to provide for their family." "Simon, I believe that everything will be fine, but I'm worried about grandmother. How will she be alone here? Answered Elizabeth, squeezing the hand of her beloved in her little palm harder. Well, what's the big deal? We'll settle down and then take her to our place. I like her. I see that she is a very intelligent person, and she has a good sense of humor. To avoid upsetting him, Elizabeth did not tell her fiancé what her grandmother really thought of him. As they were talking, the young people finally noticed the rain, which had barely begun to fall, and turned back. But the weather was deteriorating at an alarming rate. Not 5 minutes later, the downpour was like a wall around them. The couple was halfway back to their car when there was a terrible rumble in the mountains above them, and the ground trembled. Nature seemed to have gathered all her strength and brought down a mighty torrent of mudslides. It swept away everything in its path, approaching the place where the couple had stopped with unbelievable speed. Unfortunately, it was too late for Elizabeth and Simon to escape. In a matter of seconds, the pair was swept by a mudslide straight into the river. The turbulent stream swept them both up and untied the hands of the lovers, who only had time to shout words of love. Several days passed. As best he could, leaning on a stick, Simon hurried to the house of his beloved. He had injured his leg in the mud flow, hitting the stony bottom of the river, but still managed to get out on the bank. That's where the rescue team found him, and they took him to the hospital. Simon was mad with worry over Elizabeth, so when he was released from the hospital, he immediately went to Elizabeth's house. But the door was opened by Mrs. Torres, dressed all in black. Simon was pale in horror, but he had no idea that the elderly woman had noticed him from a distance and quickly changed her clothes. "What's with Elizabeth? Where is she?" whispered the young man. "I warned Elizabeth so many times not to go with you, and now she's gone," shouted the elderly woman with hate. At these words, everything swept in front of unhappy Simon's eyes, because he felt guilty about the death of his beloved. It was his idea to go to the mountains, as Elizabeth had suggested, sitting in a cafe. Simon sank to the ground in shock and dismay. Muffled sobs shook his shoulders, and the elderly woman relentlessly hurled curses at him. After that, she slammed the door, saying that he did not even deserve to see Elizabeth's grave. Unable to endure such pain, Simon left for the capital of the state the same day, sinking into himself for a long time. He had no idea that everything his fiancée's grandmother had told him was a lie. All this time, the injured girl was in the hospital, very near to her fiancé, and she knew nothing about him until Mrs. Torres told her the same story about Simon, saying that he had been swallowed up in the mudslide. The elderly woman resigned herself to the necessity of lying for the sake of her granddaughter's well-being. After Elizabeth was discharged from the hospital, she was grief-stricken at first, but she eventually pulled herself together because now she had someone to live for. She had Simon's child under her heart, but she decided not to tell her grandmother about this because the elderly woman had a weak heart. Unfortunately, Elizabeth did not have a chance to tell her grandmother. Apparently, the pensioner was punished for her mean deed, and she did not live a month after that, dying of a heart attack. Of course, Elizabeth could not live in a town where she had lost 2 of her closest people in such a short time, so she sold her house and, in the same way as her fiancé, went to look for happiness in a distant city. It had been 3 years since Elizabeth gave birth to her daughter, Chloe. All this time, she lived in the dormitory of the cannery, where she had worked as a common laborer. The director was kind enough to help her and gave her a room. The young mother lived off her allowance, savings, and odd part-time jobs. Then, Elizabeth entered a real bad streak of luck. It all started when she became friends with a woman who was very kind, compassionate, and quietly gained Elizabeth's confidence. The woman found out that Elizabeth was all alone in the world and dreamed of having a house of her own. She offered to help her buy one. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, she trusted her. But the woman turned out to be a swindler and tricked her by registering the house in her own name. The appeal to law enforcement agencies had no result since the swindler had thought of everything. Overnight, the mother and daughter were left without savings, Then they also found themselves without a place to live because the cannery went bankrupt, and the dormitory was closed along with it. Elizabeth had nowhere else to go but to the church, where she often went to pray for the repose of the souls of her beloved and her grandmother. Despite all the misfortune, the woman had not lost her faith, and her prayers were heard. A kind elderly man was sent to help her. He lived in the city in his own comfortable apartment, but in the village an hour away, he had a summer house in which no one lived. The elderly man offered it to the mother and child. Since then, Elizabeth and Chloe began to live in that village. The years went by. Elizabeth worked as a kindergarten teacher in the city. The salary was not enough, and they lived modestly. Since Elizabeth wanted to provide her daughter with a good education, she did her best, taking part-time jobs to put some money aside for the future. Chloe was a precious child, beautiful, swarthy, and gypsy-like. Seeing how hard her mother worked, one day she decided to help. The girl had attended music school, and now, instead of waiting for her mother after school in a nearby square, she took her flute with her and went to play at the crosswalk. Passers-by took pity on the little beggar and often put coins and small bills into her hat. Of course, the girl could not help her mother much, but she still believed in the best. One day, Chloe was walking to the crossing and noticed a shaven-headed man getting out from under a car parked nearby. He took his jacket from a friend who was standing nearby, and they walked away as if nothing had happened. Chloe walked a few meters away, and the men paid no attention to a little girl who looked like a beggar. "Well done," said the man who had climbed out from under the car. "Now his car will blow up as soon as he goes to negotiate with his partner." "What a fool! How can anyone trust a man like Paul? He was in jail for a reason." "Come on, stop babbling. He pays just fine, and the rest is none of our business," replied his accomplice, looking back at Chloe. But when he saw that it appeared to be some little gypsy girl, he immediately lost interest. The men continued on their way while Chloe ran quickly to the car to wait for the owner. Simon was quite surprised when the little beggar told him not to go to the negotiations because some men had put something in his car that would make him blow up. To be on the safe side, Simon called the police, who removed the timer from underneath, counting the last minutes of his life. While they were waiting for the police, Simon had time to question the little girl about where she had come from. She told everything as it was and showed him a photo of her mother. Simon's heart fluttered. Elizabeth was even more surprised than Simon when an unknown man caught her and thanked her for the fact that her daughter had saved his life. Saying that everything else was settled with the police, he would personally deliver Chloe home. Paul and his accomplices were arrested on the same day. Never would Simon have imagined that his companion, being such an honorable man, could do such a thing for the sake of money. In the evening, terribly worried about her daughter, Elizabeth was amazed when an expensive car drove up to her house, from which her daughter emerged triumphantly. A man followed her out. Shocked, Elizabeth immediately recognized him. It was her Simon, alive and unharmed. The lovers rushed into each other's arms, Chloe standing beside them, not knowing yet who this man really was. "Will you marry me?" was the only thing Simon could whisper. She replied. The poor woman and her daughter had to endure so much, but happiness returned to them. She did not hold a grudge against her grandmother, knowing perfectly well that she wanted her happiness. When the whole family spoke at the elderly woman's grave, a small cloud suddenly covered the clear sky, and a few drops of rain fell from it. Maybe that was a sign that Mrs. Torres was asking forgiveness for what she had done.